Thank you very much, Will, and to the Society for having me along today to speak about one area of my PhD research on the Victorian women's fern albums. Before I begin, I'd just like to say a big thank you to the University of St Andrews Special Collections, the University of Dundee's Museum, and also to Keswick Museum for their kind permission to use images in today's presentation. So, the study of ferns, or pteridology, was incredibly popular in the 19th century. However, women's contributions have been largely ignored, regarded instead as part of the culture of ferns, or pteridomania. As David Allen notes, the study of ferns lies in a cultural no man's land, wedged uncomfortably and discomfortingly between the history of taste and the history of science. These more cultural manifestations were not inherently unscientific, but they were often the types of scientific production that were produced by women. It's therefore important to reconsider 19th century pteridology to explore a wider range of scientific productions in order to rehabilitate the substantial and wide-ranging contributions made by women across the century as authors, botanical illustrators, specimen collectors, early photographers, and as fern album creators. These fern albums were just one area of scientific production which provided women with the opportunity to disseminate their botanical knowledge. This paper will explore the fern albums created by two women, Maria Wright, who produced albums in the Lake District in the 1850s, and Phoebe Jaffrey, who produced albums in Darjeeling between 1879 and 1885. Both Wright and Jaffrey's albums demonstrate sophisticated botanical collecting practices and processes of specimen preservation. In addition, they also demonstrate the environmental and colonial implications of pteridology. It will consider fern albums as just one method of scientific production through which women's contributions can be rehabilitated. It will consider these albums chiefly as scientific productions to demonstrate the breadth of women's study and emphasize the importance of looking beyond to look at less traditionally scientific sources in order to rehabilitate women's place within 19th century pteridology and botany. Botany had always been an area of scientific study accessible to women. However, from the 1830s onwards, they became increasingly excluded from the increasingly professionalizing discipline, which sought to distance itself from the feminine traditions of women and plant collecting. As Anne Steer argues, to rehabilitate the work of women botanists, we must enlarge our ideas about scientific work to include activities at the conventional margins of professional and proto-professional involvement. Fern albums are just one of the many sources of scientific production utilised by women during this period. They incorporate a variety of botanical skills, including collecting, botanical identification, and the creation of herbarium specimens. Botanical identification, particularly of ferns, became increasingly accessible, particularly with the swathes of popular works written on ferns by both men and by women around the middle of the 19th century. Collecting was an accepted means through which women could undertake botanical study, and was encouraged by many of the women who wrote these popular fern guides. The process of pressing plants for herbarium or album use was also an accessible skill for women to learn during this period. Fern albums therefore emerge as an extension of these collection practices and of the popularity of herbarium creation during this period. I've chosen to focus today on those albums which were created by women for commercial purposes as opposed to personal albums. While personal albums also record women's personal botanical development, their collecting, and their connections to the environment, they are often on a smaller and more limited scale. The first album I will look at today are those produced by Maria Wright. Wright was born in 1821 and was the daughter of Charles Hewer Wright, a popular tour guide and geologist in Keswick, who was known to have led tours for members of the royal family. He owned a shop on St. John's Street in Keswick, and Maria sold botanical specimens from this shop over many years. On the 1851 census, Maria and her sister Jane are both recorded as botanists, a rather remarkable statement for this period. Michael Hayward has argued that Wright was one of the first people to produce commercial tourist-style fern herbaria, alongside her counterpart Elizabeth Harvey, who was creating albums for sale in Edinburgh. A close analysis of Wright's albums reveals their importance in creating a record of her botanical and pteridological study and expertise regarding the ferns of the Lake District. Maria Wright had been collecting plants for sale as early as the beginning of the 1840s. George Stacey Gibson wrote of her good collection of plants and considerable acquaintance with the localities of them. She also sold pressed herbarium specimens to William Borer in 1844. In addition to this, she took him to see specimens in their natural habitat, further emphasizing her thorough botanical knowledge of the area surrounding Keswick. She sent specimens to some of the leading pteridologists of her day, including Edward Newman and Thomas Moore. Her specimens of Asplenium trichomane and Asplenium rutimuraria are credited in Moore's Ferns of Great Britain and Ireland. By the time she was producing her fern albums in the 1850s, she was therefore an experienced botanical collector. Her albums can thus be viewed as the culmination of many years' work with ferns and with other plants, providing detailed visual records of her collecting. Unfortunately, few examples of Wright's albums survive today. Michael Hayward has suggested that this is likely because she was primarily producing and selling loose herbarium sheets as opposed to albums, which would have been less likely to have her name recorded. The example album I'll be referring to throughout this presentation today is held at Keswick Museum. This album, titled Ferns of Cumberland, named and arranged according to G.W. Francis, collected by Miss Wright of Keswick, is dated to 1851 and contains 32 loose pages of fern specimens from across the area. The ferns included in this album range across several genus, including Polypodium, Asplenium, Lastrea, and Lycopodium. Each is pressed and displayed on the page. The majority is cut fronds, but some with the roots attached. Each is labelled with a printed label containing the botanical name of the specimen and the location from which it was collected. In providing these labels, Wright creates an album which can be used by her customers to identify specimens and assist in their own botanical collecting. They also represent her familiarity with the accepted botanical classifications of her day. Her covering label, while printed, leaves the space for the book used for naming and arrangement blank, suggesting that she was actively using and familiar with various different works. Oops. One particularly interesting fern which is included in this album is the specimen of Aspium latifolium, which on its label includes the statement, new to the British flora. This variety of lady fern was specific to the Lake District, and Wright is credited with its discovery there by William Jackson Hooker in his The British Ferns. Her albums are therefore significant records of fern discoveries, and significantly, those which were made by women. Throughout the 19th century, women supplied ferns to the Hookers at Kew and other leading botanists from across Britain and across the world. Many were included in the leading pteridological works of the day, and while they were often credited, their original specimens remain inside institutional herbarium collections. It's therefore significant that Wright's original discovery is preserved in this album. This map displays the locations of most of the specimens featured in the Keswick Museum album. Although most of the ferns come from the crags and mountains surrounding Keswick itself, Wright was also collecting from as far south as Arnside. Her considerable experience as a botanical collector allowed her to curate an album of diverse specimens from across the region. Her album of Cumbrian ferns are therefore important scientific records of her own pteridological work, and invaluable records of the fern distribution during this period. Women like Maria Wright undoubtedly contributed to the eradication of British fern species, which occurred in tandem with the rising popularity of the study of ferns. Specimens in her album, like the Osmunda regalis, are now considered rare in the Lake District. and indeed in many other areas of Britain, due in large part to over-collecting during the Victorian period. However, it's important to remember that collecting was an essential part of botanical learning, particularly for women during the 19th century. It was through physically going out into the Cumbrian hills and collecting plants that Wright had become a skilled and respected botanical collector. And while she certainly participated in the ecological destruction surrounding the increasingly popular tourist trade for botanical albums, the creation of such albums was foundational to her developing botanical knowledge. Viewed as a botanical and scientific object, Wright's Ferns of Cumberland represent her skill at identifying and collecting ferns. Without her albums, she appears merely as a footnote in the botanical texts and articles of the men to whom she sold ferns. Her albums demonstrate her skill as a collector, her deep knowledge of the ferns of the Lake District, and the ways in which she participated in the study of ferns as a specimen collector and album creator. The study and culture of ferns was as significant across the British Empire as it was in Britain, particularly in places like New Zealand, Australia, and India, where ferns were abundant. Phoebe Jaffrey's Darjeeling fern albums are just one example which demonstrate women's contribution to the study of Indian ferns, as well as highlighting their involvement in the exploitation of plants which characterised colonial botany. Born Phoebe Daniels in 1834, she married the horticulturalist Andrew Thomas Jaffrey in Darjeeling in 1875, following the death of her first husband. Following their marriage, Andrew and Phoebe lived in Rungaroon, on the site of the first Darjeeling Botanic Garden, before relocating to Darjeeling itself, where Andrew became the curator of the new Lloyd Botanic Garden in 1878. Following the death of Andrew in 1885, there is no evidence that Phoebe produced any more fern albums, and she died in Bengal on the 25th of February 1893. It was during her time in Darjeeling between 1879 and 1885 that she produced her albums of Darjeeling ferns. Jaffrey's albums each comprise approximately 50 sheets and were sold individually or part of sets of 2 or 3. The albums feature a wide range of specimens displayed simply on the page, with the roots intact. The more decorative display of several fronds of Chelianthus, as seen here, was included in some albums on the second page as a form of cover. These albums included a wide range of specimens, including aspleniums, nephrodiums, aspidiums, adiatums, polystichums, and polypodiums. Importantly, Jaffrey's albums were meticulously hand-labelled. This example includes the botanical genus, species, and location of collection. The majority of Jaffrey's specimens do not include specific collection dates, with this example with the specimen dated to 1882 being an exception. Her albums demonstrate the breadth of her botanical knowledge of the ferns of the Himalayas and her commitment to ensuring accurate descriptions. Like Wright, Jaffrey clearly had extensive pteridological knowledge, as demonstrated through her accurate and thorough botanical classification seen throughout her albums. The foothills of the Himalayas surrounding Darjeeling were rich with ferns during this period, as this painting from Marianne North demonstrates. It was also a familiar landscape for the European traveller, one which, for the English travel writer Elizabeth Sarah Musicelli, often evoked the Alps. Contemporary guidebooks included example excursions where ferns could be easily collected, with Thacker's guidebook of the 1890s describing one such excursion around Darjeeling where at least 30 different fern specimens could be collected. However, Jaffrey's albums also contain rarer specimens, which were found at considerable altitudes and fairly inaccessible locations, such as the Onychium japonicum, which, according to Catherine Lyle's Geographical Handbook of Ferns, was found at 9,000 to 10,000 feet in the Himalayas. These albums, which feature a mix of common and rarer ferns, demonstrate the incredible breadth of Jaffrey's pteridological knowledge. Unlike Maria Wright, who collected all her own specimens, it's unclear how many of the specimens in Jaffrey's albums that she had personally collected herself. There was a precedent for botanical collectors in the region to utilise local guides in the collection of specimens, as Joseph Hooker had done during his time in Darjeeling between 1847 and 1851. While Jaffrey may not have collected all of the specimens herself, her albums demonstrate the incredible sophisticality of her specimen preservation and botanical identification. These albums also demonstrate how women contributed to the knowledge of global ferns by transporting them back to Britain. While outside the traditional botanical collecting networks of Kew, they remain important examples of women's roles in knowledge generation. The albums contributed to the wider processes of colonial collecting and appropriation of specimens, which saw global ferns transported into the British domestic space. They also had significant environmental implications, as Wright's albums did in Britain. It's impossible to know how many albums Jaffrey was producing, although she was using over 150 different species of ferns. With 50 fern fronds per album, and the albums often sold in sets of 2 or 3, she was clearly acquiring considerable numbers of specimens. However, women's fern albums do have a lasting scientific legacy. They preserve specimens of now rare or extinct ferns. They therefore remain important sources for pteridological study, particularly those albums like Wright's and Jaffrey's, which record the ferns within a specific geographical locality. Both Wright and Jaffrey's skills at drying specimens allowed them to press ferns which contained spores, which remarkably remain largely intact in examples of the albums today. As Molly Duggins argues, the Victorian book and album were thus actively involved in imitating, preserving, and memorialising the natural world. These albums not only preserve women like Wright and Jaffrey's botanical contributions, but they preserve the fern landscapes of Cumbria and Darjeeling as they were in the second half of the 19th century. In conclusion, both the fern albums of Maria Wright and Phoebe Jaffrey demonstrate the importance of fern albums as objects to rehabilitate women's contributions to 19th century pteridology. These albums served as cultural and scientific manifestations of women's botanical collecting. Fern albums, particularly these commercial ones, were not purely aesthetic objects, but were skillful examples of botanical specimen preservation and identification, and provide a visual record of the incredible pteridological skill of women whose contributions would otherwise go overlooked. They also reveal the ways in which women, particularly those like Phoebe Jaffrey in India, were part of the wider colonial acquisition of specimens and the environmental implications of fern collecting. Fern albums are therefore important objects, both to the history of pteridology in the 19th century, but also to women's contributions to botany. By looking beyond traditionally scientific sources to consider sources such as fern albums, women's contributions to 19th century pteridology can be brought to the fore. Thank you.